welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Professor John Coleman, who will welcome us and give a few words of introduction to our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. As Alejandro said, I'm John Coleman. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and I just have to say, I swear it's not always this cold. That is, Minnesota does get cold in the winter, and I moved here from the University of Wisconsin back in July and August of last year, and I had people warning me how cold it gets in Minnesota in the winter. And I said, well, I think I had pretty good field training in Wisconsin because it gets pretty chilly there as well. I was just pointing out that if you look at your app, I swear it's getting into the 40s next week. So just hang around and it'll warm up. I'd like to welcome you to this symposium, Contested Past, Contested Future, Social Memories in Human Rights in Post-Communist Europe. I'm very grateful to those of you who have traveled a long way to be with us, to participate, and to share your expertise on the region. We're also grateful to the sponsors and co-sponsors who have made this major event possible. Those include the Institute for Advanced Study, the Institute for Global Studies, the Center for Austrian Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Department of History, the Center for Jewish Studies, the European Studies Consortium, and the Onanessian Endowment Fund for Justice and Peace Studies, which is provided through the Minneapolis Foundation. This symposium represents the second year of a collaboration supported by the Institute for Advanced Study here at the University of Minnesota that seeks to promote interdisciplinary debate under the theme Reframing Mass Violence. The intellectual leaders of this collaboration are Alejandro Baer, who we just heard from, Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and Barbara Fry, Director of the Human Rights Program. They've been joined in planning by Professor Joachim Sabelsberg of the Department of Sociology. My background is as a political scientist, and as a political scientist, I know about the great and vast interest in the study of mass violence and social memory in that discipline. And I am quite familiar with the outstanding, stimulating, and groundbreaking important scholarship that has been done in that field. At the time when I was at the University of Wisconsin, and I was a department chair and a grad director and associate chair, so I was interacting with people in a lot of ways. I saw interest in these questions, the questions of this conference, grow exponentially over that time among our faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates. And I think that same story is replicated in my discipline in political science departments around the country and around the world. Mass violence and social memory is, of course, an extensive field of study, and it appropriately and necessarily goes far beyond any one particular discipline. So the goals of the collaboration here on campus have been to promote productive intellectual interactions among researchers at the University of Minnesota and both the University of Minnesota and scholars beyond as well, with a theoretical, methodological, and policy interest in human rights and public remembrance. Discussions over the past 2 years have engaged students and scholars across multiple universities, colleges, centers, and departments. Last year, the 2013-14 academic year, the collaboration focused on social memories in Latin America and and Southern Europe, revisiting legacies of dictatorship, state terror, and grave human rights violations. The first year of the Reframing Mass Violence Collaborative brought distinguished experts from the countries of study to discuss their work and engage in dialogue with local scholars, students, and the public. The discussions centered on contemporary processes of reinterpretation and reframing of the atrocities themselves and the transitional justice models that were adopted in their aftermath. In its second year, this year, the collaborative has shifted its regional focus to post-communist Europe. the breadth of this week's symposium demonstrates that the focus on Eastern European experiences regarding social memories and human rights will show a vastly different approach from the mechanisms and logics of transitional justice in Latin America, as well as illustrate the variation between countries in post-communist Europe themselves. One of today's speakers, Professor Jelena Subotic, my friend and former colleague at the University of Wisconsin, she points out Eastern Europe's transitions of the 20th and 21st centuries have been multi-layered and overlapping. In her words, quote, "From peace to war to unstable peace in the Balkans and the Caucasus. From multi-ethnic federal to ethnic nation-states, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. From centrally planned economy to some hybrid free market. And from authoritarianism to some type of democracy across the region." This week's discussions will build an interdisciplinary knowledge base on issues facing Eastern Europe and other regions with regard to the understanding of the causes and effects of mass atrocities, the construction of memory about those atrocities, and the struggle to respond to past mass violence and to prevent future violence. This is critically important work for anyone in the public, in governmental circles, wherever they might be, who wonders what is the relationship of higher education to dealing with important, fundamental social, political, historical problems. The topic of this conference, I think, is an excellent answer to that question. Societies around the world are grappling with how to deal with the memories of the past, how to define the past, and to understand how that will shape their futures. Even countries that don't necessarily identify themselves as having had those kinds of histories need to understand the way that the memories are being constructed in other societies and other nations. So this is indeed critically important work. It is an effective answer to the question of how does the Academy contribute to the solution of grand challenges and important public problems. By bringing together scholars from the social sciences, law, history, the arts, and the humanities, along with diplomats and human rights practitioners, this symposium is bound to stimulate meaningful new thinking about the effects of and responses to mass violence. Again, I welcome you to the University of Minnesota, and I quite sincerely thank you for the work you do in this vitally significant area of scholarship, creative work, and public life. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor back over to Alejandro Baer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Coleman. And again, welcome everyone to our symposium. We'd also like to thank again the Institute for Advanced Studies for hosting this collaborative and for supporting it, and of course all the co-sponsors that made possible this symposium. Our collaborative is titled Reframing Mass Violence. And with this title, what we are implying is that we're interested in how societies look back, how they revisit their legacies of dictatorship, state terror, genocide, or other grave human rights violations. So we are not in the immediate aftermath of mass violence. Time has passed, often one or even more generations have passed since the event, at least in the cases that we analyzed, most of the cases we analyzed for Latin America or Spain last year. And also time has passed, one generation at least, since the so-called transitions, regime change, mostly from authoritarian rule to democracy, major transformation that affected institutions and political culture. In Spain, the transition took place in the late 70s, in Argentina and Uruguay in the 80s, in Chile in the early 90s. 25 years have passed now since the fall of the Berlin Wall that initiated a major transformation, regime change in the Soviet bloc. Most of the countries in Latin America, Spain, but also in the post-communist area, are still confronting and often belatedly facing the legacies of violence. We have seen through many of the cases that we've analyzed that countries have adopted trials and truth commissions in some cases, other transitional justice mechanisms, other countries did not. Over the years, most countries have introduced some sort of restitutive initiatives on a political and symbolic level. Cultural and educational manifestations have emerged, such as memorials, museums, etc. In many countries, we find the reopening of a discussion regarding the transitional justice models and mechanisms that were adopted. And we see that a new generation is questioning how the previous generation has dealt with that past, has dealt with those legacies. We clearly could see from the presentations in this collaborative that these initiatives in the legal, in the cultural, and in the political fields were not taking place in isolation, but rather in an increasingly global arena of interconnected memory cultures. And a core aspect of these is the human rights regime, or as Jane Cohen has put it, a human rights culture that has pushed far beyond the strictly legal realm by producing new subjectivities, relations, identities, new politics. As a transnational trend permeating memory cultures, it can be considered a significant factor in this re-emergence, revisiting, reinterpreting, reframing of past atrocities. Now, framed in human rights terminology through specifically legally bound concepts such as genocide, crimes against humanity, forced disappearances. They have become a guide for action for grassroots organizations. They shape the content and terminology in ceremonies, in museums, in memorials, other sites of memory. They also become recurrent tropes in literature, in film, in the arts. The multiplicity of local translations of this global trend poses many questions that we are interested in addressing through interdisciplinary conversations and in case-by-case explorations, and also today and tomorrow with our invited scholars. What factors contribute to the emergence and disappearance of certain memories in the public sphere? What is the role of organizations and institutions such as the judicial world, human rights advocacy networks, mass media, the academic community, that mediate the production, public articulation, and circulation, the legitimation of memories, of mass violence in different contexts? How can we account for fluctuations and dispute, or stability and consensus on interpretations of the past or memory regimes? Throughout the conversations that we had in the last year, many interesting questions emerged, questions that we want to bring back again into the conversation today and tomorrow. For instance, for Brazil, Argentina, or Spain, the question that was always present is, how long does a society transition? How far back shall we remember? And see, just justice, accountability, redress. We have seen that the arts and cultural practices have counteracted the so-called eras of impunities in different countries. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have also heard, and this was the presentation of Lee Payne last year, on Argentina, that a transitional justice can actually go too far. Justice can produce also harmful and one-sided truths. What is a fair memory in that respect? And we saw the need to rethink that triad of truth, memory, justice, that justicia y memoria, which is a common sense triad very much here in the Spanish-speaking world. So we have also seen that memorization and continuous narration of past massive violence can have adverse effects. It may not advance the coexistence of adversarial groups within a society. But often it may intensify their enmity. Many of these questions seem to be also very relevant for post-communist Europe. In yesterday's lecture, Professor Himka discussed the role that memory plays in contemporary discussions of national identity in Eastern Europe, particularly the role of the Holocaust in national narratives. Is a national memory constructed to affirm and glorify the collective, or does it do justice to those who have been wronged and abused in the past? Does it exclude painful and shameful incidents in order to raise the collective self-image? Or does it provide room to account for historical crimes and the taking of responsibility? Does it allow complexity? Or does it only enforce unity, these sort of affirmative narratives of the nation, which we heard yesterday through Jean-Paul Himka's lecture? These questions, writes memory scholar Aleida Assmann, show that constructions of memories are immediately tied to constructions of societies. We are not dealing just with different historical narratives and memory policies, but also with different and maybe even irreconcilable values. So this is what makes it worthwhile observing these processes very carefully, very closely, and this is what makes the need, where's the need to analyze them critically. So this is what we plan to do in the coming 2 days, and thank you again for being here. Welcome, and it's my pleasure now to ask our first two presenters, our first panel, Europe's Divided Memory, Lars Breuer and Matti, Jutila, to take the floor. Thank you. A few words of introduction to Lars Breuer. Our first speaker today is Lars Breuer, who is a research associate at the Institute for Sociology at the Free University of Berlin, working on the research project Collective Memory as a basis for identification with Europe, a project funded by the German Research Foundation. He studied cultural studies, politics, and sociology in Berlin, Copenhagen, and Lüneburg, and received his MA in cultural studies from the Humboldt University in Berlin. From 2004 to 2006, he was a research assistant in the project International Traditions of Historical Consciousness at the Center for Interdisciplinary Memory Studies in Essen. From 2007 to 2009, Lars Breuer was a PhD fellow at this institution, and in 2013 he finished his dissertation about German and Polish vernacular memory of World War II and received his PhD from the Leibniz University in Hamburg. Thank you, Lars, for being with us today in this symposium. We very much look forward to this discussion. Please join me in welcoming Lars Breuer.
Hello, and thank you first of all for the invitation and the interest in my work. I'm going to speak about victimhood and vernacular memory in Germany and Poland. And first of all, I'm going to explain what I actually mean by vernacular memory. And I have to say that this paper discusses memory of World War II in Germany and Poland. And this refers to a larger study that has been done focusing on World War II, because we assume that this is still the historic event where we have the strongest links between collective memory and collective self-understanding or collective identification. So I'm first going to speak about the vernacular memory, then I'm going to briefly sketch the national patterns of memory of World War II that we found in Germany and Poland. And then I'm going to go on to speak about the role of victimhood as kind of a common denominator in both national patterns. And then I'm going to try to lay out a concept that tries to cover different ways in which competing memory narratives deal with each other, which is called multidirectional memory. So for vernacular memory, for a number of reasons, most empirical studies on collective memory focus on publicly available forms of memory. So mass media, parliamentary debates are the most common media referred to. And however, I think this neglects a very important part of collective memory, namely the appropriation of those memory narratives by individuals. Because as Jeffrey Olling once put it, it's actually only individuals who do the actual remembering. So I think it is important to draw in this aspect of appropriation and reproduction of memory narratives. And because public memory can be dealt with or can be perceived in different ways. And this is why so I'm going to do this on an empirical level, but also on a theoretical level. I would like to distinguish three what I call realms of memory. So you could say that public memory, which I refer to, is kind of the default. And this, excuse me, this refers to, this was one too early, to publicly available forms of memory. So usually mass media, this could range from newspaper articles to books, movies, TV shows, and the like. And in this realm, it has to do a lot about the distribution and availability of memory narratives for large audiences. So this is why economic figures like circulation numbers or TV ratings often play a decisive role in which narrative is chosen and which topic is addressed and the way this is done. And then we have a second realm that you could call the official memory, which can be understood as the institutionalization, of those public narratives that have become hegemonic in a way. So here the main agent is the state or state-like agents, and the usual media would be museums, memorials, commemoration days, official speeches, and so on. And in this realm, memories are often chosen deliberately to pursue certain present-day political interests or rationales. And then I think there's a third realm, which I call vernacular memory, or actually I borrowed that term from John Wagner. And this can be described as the appropriation and reproduction of public narratives by ordinary people. This is also often referred to as a private memory. And in this realm, we have a lot of like face-to-face communication among friends, colleagues, or peers is the most important medium. And this is also, I think, vernacular memory is what you get, or at least what you can simulate when you're doing interviews. So in the following, I'm going to focus on this realm of vernacular memory. Nevertheless, it's important to stress that those three realms are not at all separated from each other, but actually do overlap and interact. But the crucial point for me is that this vernacular memory can draw on different elements of the other two realms. So for example, for some people their own personal experience could be decisive, or it could be grandma's bedtime stories or her own experiences, or it could be what people learned in school, or it could be a recent feature movie they've seen. So, and this is actually what I wanted to find out by examining this vernacular memory, what people actually draw upon. So in order to get insight into this vernacular memory in Germany and Poland, the research project conducted a number of 20 group discussions in both Germany and Poland, with a total of almost 180 participants of different age, profession, and background. And the idea was well, first of all, focus groups or group discussions, as they're also called, are a brilliant tool to investigate how people negotiate meanings, and in this specific context, how they negotiate specific memories within a given social context. And different groups were selected by criteria motivated by the wish to cover a broad range of memory narratives that we find within a given society. So here you see the list of groups we interviewed. However, 20 groups cannot cover the whole thing, so you have to bear in mind that whenever I speak about German and Polish vernacular memory in the following, I'm going to refer to these data only. And my analytical focus have been the various roles that participants ascribe to their own in-group, but also to other groups in this, namely other national groups. And here the roles of victims and perpetrators by far prevailed. And what we did that we presented or we stimulated the group discussions with a number of photographs that depicted different situations in the context of World War II, and the participants, as expected, mainly addressed three historical events. That's World War II, the Holocaust, and forced migration. And there have been quite some differences between single groups, but the largest differences did appear, of course, between the German and the Polish groups. So in other words, we do find strong national patterns, but we also have a variety of different memory narratives within these national frameworks, which I'm going to present now briefly. Overall, there's a striking imbalance between Poles talking about Germans vis-a-vis Germans talking about Poles. Throughout all Polish groups, the relationship to Germans, but also to a certain extent to Russians, is one of the most vividly discussed topics, whereas Germans hardly ever speak about Poles at all, not even when they speak about the atrocities of World War II. And in Germany, the discussions are rather consensual and self-referential in the way that Germans mostly speak about themselves, albeit they do this often implicitly. So they just talk general, but it's obvious from the context that they only talk about themselves. And in terms of role attributions, it's striking that Germans tend to predominantly portray themselves as victims of the war and of National Socialism. And victimhood is by far the most frequent attribution used for Germans by the German participants. And in many cases, individual experiences of suffering are collectivized on a national level. But then again, when it comes to perpetratorship, German participants rather avoid these national categorizations. And as a consequence, the dealing with perpetratorship in German often remains vague or blurry. So many participants seem to perceive the Nazi past still as some kind of a burden that prevents them from freely expressing their national belonging or their national identity. And especially some younger Germans also state this explicitly. And there's two strategies I could identify how Germans deal with this perceived burden of the past. And one is externalization, which means that perpetratorship is assigned either to individuals or to certain groups, and most often this group is simply called the Nazis, but it's never mentioned who the Nazis are and how they differ from the Germans. It's just to make clear that it's not us, the Germans, but them, the Nazis. And in many cases, perpetratorship is not even addressed at all. So we do have a lot of stories being told by German participants where you have clear victims, but you don't have any perpetrators, or people are depicted as victims of the times of the war, so without any agency, really. And then we have a second strategy, which I call diffusion, or you could call it blurring also, which means that Germans draw a lot of comparisons or analogies to other atrocities and wars and the like. To put it bluntly, this is to say that we were not the only bad guys. So this is like the German case. And the Polish case, we find that national categorizations prevail by far, and this goes for both perpetratorship and victimhood. There's a clear pattern throughout all Polish groups which says that the Poles as a nation have been the victims of the Germans and the Russians. And it's important to stress that it's not about the Soviets, but about the Russians, literally, in the interview. But beyond this clear pattern, there is much less consensus in the Polish groups than in the German ones. And Polish participants do comment and reflect a lot about how memory is being dealt with in other places or in other countries, namely in Germany. And here we have and how these conflicting memories are interacting. And here we find different, you could almost say it's two different views in the interviews, and I think they reflect what I would call a deep polarization in terms of political and cultural affairs that we have in Poland nowadays, which is reflected in the interviews, where you can almost identify two camps or two views. And according to the first view, it is very clear that Polish victimhood during World War II is not being acknowledged enough by people abroad. And there's even, there's even perceived a so-called falsification of history coming from abroad. So, and also the addressing of Polish perpetratorship or Polish collaboration, for example, would be perceived as a falsification of history, which is the Polish victimhood. And most advocates of this view treat perpetratorship and victimhood as first of all as a national thing, and then and second as mutually exclusive categories. So to give you one example, since Germans are responsible for the war and its consequences, no German can claim any recognition as a victim, because as a German, he or she would be responsible for the war. So, and if you are responsible, if you're a perpetrator, you cannot be a victim. This is this first view. And supporters of the second view, they rather distinguish between personal experiences of suffering on one hand and political responsibility on the other hand. And also, they highlight the variety of different experiences and the various degrees of both suffering and responsibility. So perpetratorship and victimhood are not mutually exclusive anymore. However, these evaluations, when they come up in the discussions, are always very contested and lead to intense debate among the group members. So to put these national patterns on a more general level, you could say that the participants' images of the past and closely intertwined with this, their national self-understanding, is kind of challenged by the confrontation with the transnational memory discourses. And this goes especially when it comes to perpetratorship and victimhood. So several, just to connect this to the national patterns again, several German respondents complain about being haunted by a past which, according to their self-image, they have nothing to do with anymore. And in the Polish case, we have a lot of criticism of what participants perceive as an insufficient acknowledgement of Polish suffering, also abroad. So, and the common denominator in both cases is a feeling of misperception of the own experiences by the others or by people abroad. And of course, I think it's important to stress that this feeling of misperception is not so much about the historic events themselves, but rather about different ways of dealing with this past. And here I think the victimhood comes into play. In recent years, victimhood, suffering, and trauma have become key concepts in the representation of historical events, not only but also in my material. And here, narratives of past events are often centered around stories of suffering and hardships. And often these stories are being told to claim kind of a collective victim status. Victims have, so to speak, become the new heroes of memory. But throughout my work, I wondered why it is especially attractive to depict yourself as a helpless object of the deeds of others. And I came to the conclusion that the dominance of these victimhood narratives in my material suggests that victimhood has actually become a desirable status, first and foremost because it can serve as a resource of acknowledgement, especially within these transnational memory frameworks. So there is kind of a transnational memory trajectory, which this learning lessons from the past, which is a way of making sense of remembering in a positive way. So in this slide, victim status is desirable because it allows, or it even promises, a moral surplus from remembering past events. So those who are victims can claim to have learned a lesson from the past, and in certain cases they can even accuse others of not having learned enough, or not yet, or whatever. However, it's important to stress that the meaning of victimhood can be entirely different. For example, in Germany, victimhood, I would say, first and foremost equals innocence, whereas for many Poles, there's still an understanding of victimhood which is rooted in Christianity, which is closer to a notion of martyrdom, in which victims actually are heroes, at least in a moral sense. And that's pretty different from the German case. So the question arises if victimhood can be understood as a universal category, which can eventually even lead to some kind of a transnational memory, or if rather particular claims of certain groups conflicting with other people's or other groups' claims of victimhood are competing with each other. And usually, or like the common notion would be that you have something like a victim competition, which goes like a zero-sum game, saying that if one group wins attention or acknowledgement for their suffering, another group is bound to lose it. So, and at first glance, this also applies to my data. But when I took a closer look, I was somehow puzzled because it didn't really fit, and so I went on searching for concepts that allow to map different ways of how different claims of victimhood interact with each other. And what I found to be most promising was a concept introduced by Michael Rothberg in 2009, what he called multi-directional memory. And he was actually examining different ways of dealing with the Holocaust and with post-colonial experiences in literature. And Rothberg suggested to view the encounter of different memories rather as something productive, and something as what he called, quote, an ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, so not as something destructive or competitive. And he outlined like a matrix in order to map different types of interaction, which you see here. He proposed a matrix defined by two axes. So on the one hand, you have on the horizontal line, you have an axis of comparison with the poles of equation on the left and differentiation on the right. And then you have an axis of political effect, which reaches from solidarity on the bottom to competition on the top. And I'm going to try to illustrate these different modes I numbered by giving you some quotations from my participants. So the first model would be the competitive differentiation, field number one. Here, this resembles more or less what I call the victim competition. And here, to give you a first quote, Krzysztof, a university student from Western Poland, says, "There's currently a struggle going on about the shaping of the historical memory in the younger generation. Poland doesn't take a firm voice, it doesn't take up the subject, who the actual victims and who the executioners were, these boundaries will vanish. So here we have a clear distinction between perpetrators and victims. They're clearly mutually exclusive categories, and also clearly obviously national categories. There's a clear division between them and us. In a more narrow sense, victimhood competition means actually that there are different claims of victimhood excluding each other. So to give you another quote, which is more narrow to that case, is Magda, an employee of a Warsaw museum, says, "A nation which starts a war expects that there will be casualties among their own civilians. This nation itself has to be blamed for its losses. And don't you ever compare the suffering of this," she's referring to a photograph depicting a German family escaping the bombed city of Berlin. "Don't you ever compare the suffering of this German woman to the suffering of Poland to what happened in Poland?" So this is what I talked about before, that since Germans are responsible for the war, they cannot claim any victim status, not even a German mother with her 3 children leaving or trying to leave the bombed city of Berlin. Then we have the second mode, which is solidary differentiation. Here we also have a highlighting of the differences of different historical experiences, but the intention is different. Here the differences are recognized in the prospect of a better mutual understanding. So we have Richard, a firefighter from northeastern Poland, laconically states that, well, we do have a shared past, just that some were the oppressors and the others the oppressed. That's a shared past. I mean, you could say that's rather cynical, but we actually do have a number of similar views from Polish participants. For example, Karolina, a historian from Warsaw, she says, "Germans will remember the war experience differently than Poles. I don't think the idea is to bring uniformity to this. You have to understand these different perspectives to be able to work together on conflictual topics or with those that are on the border." Although the notion of a common memory is refused here, the necessity of an actual confrontation of different memories in order to learn and to get beyond those differences is highlighted here. And then the next mode of solidary equation, we also have this aim of achieving a deeper understanding by confrontation, but the way in which differences in historic experience are treated is entirely different. So the most extreme case are literally equations of the Holocaust with other historic events. So we have Marlene, an engineer from Western Germany, saying, "If we want to become one Europe, we all have to shake hands, and every country has its Holocaust, its war, its crimes as well. There is no European country that says, 'I stayed clean.'" So here, any references to actual historic events are virtually absent. The Holocaust is blurred into just another generic wrongdoing. And as mentioned earlier, this is typical for the strategy in the German, or among the German participants, to ease this perceived burden of the past. But we also find quite similar solidary equations or equations of the Holocaust with other events in the Polish case. For example, I'll get to that equations of the Holocaust in a bit, but we also have this solidary equation, meaning an equation of or like putting historical events on a more general level in order to equate them and to turn them into some kind of a common experience. And a Polish example, an example of a Polish participant stating this is Karol, who's a colleague of the other historian I quoted before, and saying, instead of arguing about who suffered more or less, the Poles should see the suffering as such and respect it. If one sees the suffering as a common distress, it could result in more than an argument about who or when suffered most. So here the intention is the same as in the German case, to get beyond this this them and us and this exclusion, mutual exclusion of victims and perpetrators. But then again, we have a fourth mode of competitive equation. And here, in the Polish case, the Holocaust is also equated with other events, but with another intention again, and this is to justify particular claims of victimhood. And this is here is an obvious link to Matti's paper we're going to hear. So Matti, who's a politician of a extreme right-wing party in Poland, he says, and he's asked about what the memory of the Holocaust should be like. And his answer is, well, depends on how the term Holocaust is understood. Because we can speak of the Holocaust of the Jewish people or of all the nations to which a Holocaust was actually done. Because quite often this terminology is associated with the Jewish people. Or can we also refer to another nation, for example, to the Polish nation? So this, of course, in this case is a rhetoric question. For him, it's clear that Holocaust has also been done to the Polish people. And I should make clear that those literal equations of the Holocaust that we've seen in two cases now are a pretty rare phenomenon in the group discussions, but the very claim they serve to make, namely the solidary or competitive equation, is not. So this very notion of an equation of historical events is quite prevalent. So in conclusion, the data show that there is actually a variety of how different memory narratives deal with each other and how participants reflect upon, you could call it the dialogue of different claims of victimhood. And I hope I've managed to show that this typology Michael Rothberg proposed can actually be helpful to map these different modes of interaction. And applied to the national memory patterns I mentioned before, I would say that there's three common modes. In Germany, the difference of historical experience in different historical experiences are often dissolved, and Nazi crimes, including the Holocaust, are generalized into generic wrongdoings, which makes it easier, obviously, for Germans to deal with this legacy. And it also allows Germans to claim recognitions as victims of the war or of the dictatorship in more general terms, in accordance with other groups or other nations who make the same claim. And in Poland, the analogies of suffering of non-Jewish Poles with the Holocaust often serve to justify Polish claims of victimhood. So overall, we see the decisive role the Holocaust plays in all four modes, in all four fields in the matrix. Because on the one hand, the Holocaust has become a universal container for evil as such and for all sorts of large-scale mass atrocities, for crimes against humanity. And on the other hand, comparisons to the Holocaust often serve to legitimate groups' particular claims of victimhood, as we will also see in the next paper. And in Germany, I already mentioned this strategy to ease this perceived burden of the past by dissolving differences in historic experiences. And in Poland, we have these analogies with the Holocaust to serve the Polish claim of victimhood and to stress that Polish victimhood is not acknowledged enough on a transnational level. So metaphorically speaking, victimhood has become kind of common currency in transnational memory, in which memory narratives are being dealt with and in which the value of a given group, so to speak, is measured. And in this currency trade, you could argue the Holocaust is still kind of the gold standard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lars, and also thank you for keeping the time. Great punctuality.
There's a few chairs up front.
Yeah, there's some chairs. There's three.
There's some chairs up front if people want.
I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Matti, who is a visiting professor here at the University of Minnesota. He's from Finland. the main unifying theme of his research has been nationalism, how it affects contemporary world politics and the construction of political communities. His doctoral research investigated how transnational governance of the rights of national minorities has challenged nationalism externally by circumscribing the sovereignty of nation-states and internally by challenging the idea of national homogeneity as a foundation of political community. He has also analyzed national majority-minority relations, focusing especially on the role of historical narratives and myths in these processes. That's a topic also, or part of that is the research he will present today. His presentation is titled Constructing Genocidal Marxism in Post-Communist Europe. Thank you, Matti.
Okay, thank you. I'm using my own computer, so let's see how fast we can get this working. So, my research, my presentation today is based on a research project in which I worked called Memory at War. It was a large collaborative project coordinated by the University of Cambridge with involvement from University of Helsinki and University of Bergen, in which we studied how Second World War is commemorated today in various countries in Europe. And as one kind of a sub-project of that large collaborative, we also analyzed one particular kind of manifestation of commemoration of the Second World War, namely a documentary film produced by a Latvian director Edwin Snorre and supported by a nationalist group from the European Parliament. The documentary is called The Soviet Story, so I will be focusing on mostly on that today. So this is kind of a side project for me, and I actually feel like a graduate student presenting here today, because in the audience we have one of the leading experts in the world on this topic, if not the leading expert, John Paul Himka, who is a great historian of Holodomor and its public representations, and also translated and edited Roman Rozhdolsky's book on the non-historic nations, Friedrich Engels' views on non-historic nations. So it kind of makes me feel like a graduate student again. But then on the other hand, I survived a PhD thesis defense on minority rights against Will Kimlicka, so maybe I'll this also. And in the Finnish system, it really is against. We don't have committees, we have opponents. So I will talk about one kind of manifestation of this kind of competitive victimhood discussed by Lars in his presentation. And I think the central concept here when we discuss the construction of this kind of genocidal Marxism in European politics today is the idea of the so-called double genocide, and for some reason it's not showing. Now it's okay. So the double genocide thesis in the European context holds that the Soviet Union was at least as murderous as Nazi Germany. Its crimes against humanity were also ideologically motivated. They were motivated by particular strands within the Marxist tradition that clearly justify ethnic cleansing, and they also claim that, first of all, Soviet crimes were chronologically first, so they were earlier, which is undisputable. but they also say that, that Germany learned from those Soviet atrocities. They learned how to execute the Holocaust. They learned that from the Soviets. They were also motivated by the same Marxist ideas in their policies. So we see several manifestations of this double genocide thesis in contemporary European politics. I think the Black Book of Communism is one manifestation of this thesis, maybe not a really radical one. It's actually based on research with proper sources and so on. Similarly, the Prague Declaration on European Conscience and Communism that was signed in 2008 as a response to the Stockholm Declaration on commemoration of the Holocaust. This is clearly a response to the Stockholm Declaration, saying that victims of communist regimes should be equally commemorated in contemporary Europe. It cites the same ways of commemoration, but through education, public memorials, commemoration days, and so on. It says, states the exact same practices as the Stockholm Declaration, so it's clearly a response to the Stockholm Declaration signed 8 years earlier. But today I will focus on a specific instance, the Soviet Story documentary, because that's like 1.5 hours documentary that really explicitly discusses this theme. It makes a really explicit argument about the murderous nature of the Soviet Union and how it was ideologically, how these Soviet atrocities were ideologically based on Marxist doctrine. So this movie was directed by Latvian director Edvin Snorak. It premiered in April 2008 in the European Parliament. The premiere took place in the facilities of the European Parliament. And it was supported by the National Conservative European Parliament party group Union for the Europe of Nations that has since then dissolved into internal conflicts, and now we have different kind of national conservative groups in the European Parliament. But that was the main national conservative group in the European Parliament in 2008. So they partly financed that movie. It got its financial support also from various sources in Latvia. So it's clearly like kind of a politically supported project. And in the backplot of the DVD, they state that the Soviet story is a story of an allied power which helped the Nazis to fight Jews and which slaughtered its own people on an industrial scale. Assisted by the West, this power triumphed on May 9, 1945. Its crimes were made taboo, and the complete story of Europe's most murderous regime has never been told until now. So, just to give you a kind of an idea of the nature of the project, I will show the movie's trailer with the disclaimer that following presentation contains mature subject matters and may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
They destroy about 10% of the population, and that's very specific. This is used not just to kill enemies, they're not enemies, it's to restructure the fabric of society. It's a social engineering.
Marx began it. He was the ancestor of modern political genocide. People were being shot day and night. Stalin even got to the point of killing people by random, by quarters. I don't think the world, certainly Europe, has never seen that sort of murderous killing. The Soviet Foreign Ministry was surrounded by NKVD troops, tanks, and Stalin gave the order, clear out the synagogue.
Lead called an anchor of their shootings through the back of the neck. Each of them, the people were tied up, dismounted behind, on their knees.
So that's a brief glimpse of the documentary, the nature of the documentary. So it really uses imagery from Nazi and Soviet atrocities, connecting, cutting from Hitler to Stalin, clearly making this kinds of very explicit comparisons between the two. And I will present the argument of the Soviet story in a little bit more detail. And I use a kind of a crude distinction introduced by a Finnish professor of contemporary history, Jorma Kalela, who makes a distinction between two kinds of history-political activity. First, he says that that should be politics of history on the first line, not politics history. Politics of history, which refers to this kind of a rather normal activity of challenging existing interpretations of history. Kind of saying that there's something in our current understanding of certain events, certain processes that is not really right, and I want to make an intervention in the existing conditions, saying that that we should somehow change our understanding of what actually happened in Europe, in the United States, and so on. So that's pretty normal academic discussion. I think all academic research is political in that sense, that there's no sense in making research if we don't identify some kind of a flaw in the existing understanding of things. So all research, starting from physics and natural science, is political in that sense. We want to challenge the existing view on certain issues, and this is really natural part of all historical research, all public presentations of history, and so on. But then we also have another level, another kind of activity, history politics, which refers to use of history for some other ends in political disputes. So it's not the use. We don't make historical presentations in order to change the existing kind of a historical consciousness. We rather use history for some other ends, some other, in order to achieve some other goals. So I will use this distinction now in my presentation to analyze the nature of the Soviet story as a history-political act. And I will begin with politics of history. What kind of claims does the Soviet story make? What are the historical arguments that it presents? What kind of historical understanding is it challenging? And here I would say we could divide it into two parts. First of all, they want to show that Soviet atrocities were in many ways greater than those committed by Nazi Germany. And they focus especially on three things: Holodomor, deportations of whole nations, and occupation of Baltic states. And then, secondly, they also want to show that that the Soviet atrocities were also ideologically motivated. There's usually a kind of a common distinction made in public debates on the nature of Marxism as an ideology, and then the real socialism, which was a distorted interpretation of Marxism. So Soviet story wants to show that that Soviet practices can actually directly derive from Marxist ideology. These atrocities were really Marxist in nature, Marxist through and through. So, as for the first part, you also saw this graph on the trailer. They want to show that Holodomor especially was greater in numbers than the Holocaust. They don't make this comparison really explicitly. They don't really mention the death toll of Holocaust and say that Holodomor was bigger in numbers than the Holocaust. But if you think about, for example, this kind of a graph, nowadays the consensus figure for the casualties of the Holocaust is around 6 million. So this is like Holocaust plus one. They don't offer any kind of sources for these numbers. They don't say how they came up with this particular number. But it's kind of an argument that Holodomor was Holocaust plus one. And in my own paper, I actually use source. I challenge these figures. I'm not a historian, and I don't study Holodomor myself. So I challenge these figures by using using the figures from studies that cannot by any means be considered pro-Soviet. So I use the Black Book of Communism, I use Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, and I use Neymark's Stalin's Genocide as sources. And they usually end up somewhere like their figures are roughly half of what is presented by the Soviet story, saying that in Holodomor the total death toll was between 6 to 8 million, and of which between 3 to 5 million were from Ukraine. So this is a kind of a presentation of Holodomor as this kind of a Holocaust plus one, saying that it was greater, and they offer this really personal accounts of the horrors of the Holodomor. And Timothy Snyder writes that in contemporary history politics, memory is so central. It's really difficult to challenge memory when you offer these kinds of presentations of individual suffering. It's really difficult to challenge those, and usually there's of course no need to challenge any individual kind of historical memories. But it becomes problematic when you use that memory in these practices of competitive victimology, which allows a nationalist to hug himself with one arm and strike his neighbor with the other. And this is exactly what the Soviet story is doing, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. The second case study the second case in the Soviet story is the deportations of whole nations, in which they say that Stalin exiled a dozen of nations completely, part and parcel, young and old, women and men, even members of Communist Party amongst them. They were all exiled to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan. Chechen, Ingush, Kalmyks, Karachaks, Crimean Tatars. Dozen of nations completely wiped out. And there is no disputing the fact that these deportations of whole nations happened. There's no dispute about the criminal nature of those acts. Those are mass atrocities. Those are clear crimes against humanity. But again, go back to Timothy Snyder and say that yes, the deportations are cruel. They are criminal. They lead to enormous amounts of human suffering. But there's a difference between labor camp and a death camp. And for these deportations of whole nations, the death rate was really brutal, up to 25%. But it's still 25% is much less than 100. But the image is given in the Soviet story was that okay, we have Holodomor, which is Holocaust plus one in numbers, and then in addition to Ukrainians, Soviet Union totally completely wiped out a dozen of nations. Germany wiped out only one. Soviet Union wiped out a dozen nations. So in that those group numbers, in those numbers also the Soviet crimes are greater than the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. And of course, they don't say anything about the right to return of all these deported nations after Stalin's death. For Crimea Tatars, it took even longer, but Crimea Tatars, of course, are facing many kinds of difficulties still today caused by the deportation. So again, there's no denying that these acts happened. They were criminal, but in the Soviet story, they are really like bolstered to make an argument that Soviet Union was the most murderous regime in the world. And from the deportations of all nations, they continue to the Baltic states, which is really understandable because this is a Latvian project. So they claim that Kremlin strategically orchestrated ethnic cleansing of Baltic nations and that they were brought to the brink of extinction. Really saying that if we think that there was a Holocaust and then dozen nations completely wiped out, we go to 13, and with the 3 Baltic states, the figure almost goes to 16, but they were not fully successful. And again, with the Baltic states, there's no need to exaggerate the figures and human suffering because the actual deportations that took place are again clear crimes against humanity. But to claim that Baltic nations were brought to the brink of extinction is a really, really strong claim. Because there's actually an interesting difference between the 2 editions of the main historical book on the Soviet era, the Ron Misinas and Rein Taagepera's Baltic States, Years of Dependence, that covered the Soviet era. It was first published here in the United States in 1980. And in the 1980 edition, Misinas and Taagepera actually write that the status of titular languages in the Baltic States was better in 1980 than what it was during the independence because of the dominant position of German language in Baltic societies during the years of independence. That statement is removed from the 1993 edition. And of course, we can say that now they are better informed, they know more about what was actually happening in the Baltic states. But at least I'm pretty suspicious when they don't say how they learned. It's just a statement that is cut from the second edition, and they don't explain how they arrived in the new conclusion. So that makes me pretty suspicious. So in the documentary, they want to show that the Soviet Union outnumbered Nazis. They killed more nations than the Nazis. But the main claim is that these crimes were also motivated by a racist ideology, and they want to show that Marxism is a racist ideology. And it basically culminates on this set of quotes that was also shown on the trial. I think it's pretty difficult to read now, but it says that they present it as a direct quote from Marx, and it says that the classes and the races too weak to master the new condition of life must give away. And then we move on, saying that they must perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. And that is attributed to Marx. First, Marx in People's Paper in April 16, 1950, and then the second quote comes from Journal of History of Ideas from 1981. And I started tracking down these quotes and reading the full context of the quotes, and it appears that they are something completely different. So it's presented there as this kind of a political doctrine that Marx would say, be promoting Holocaust and ethnic cleansing. But if we go to the first part of the quote, that nations and races too weak to master the new condition must give way. That comes from Marx's text on post-emigration. And the quote, actually, with that quote, Marx is describing what is happening in European societies as a consequence of capitalism. It's not a political statement saying that this should be done. He says that this is happening in European societies as a consequence of capitalism. It leads to the urbanization of population, which leads to the increased class consciousness of the working class, and then we can have the class war. So he's describing what is going on in European societies, and this part of his statement on that issue. It's not a political statement on ethnic cleansing whatsoever. And same applies for the second part of the quote, that they must perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. And that quote actually comes from Friedrich Engels. It's from the Magyar struggle, and I tracked down the quote and how it was the sources, and it was actually quoted from a kind of a pamphlet that it was clearly kind of an anti-Soviet book, and that was a collection of these Marx and Engels' texts that could be shown to kind of just show the real nature of Marxism. And so I of course got curious that what kind of language were they using in German. So I went to the collected works, and in the collected works they don't speak about revolutionary Holocaust. It was revolutionären Weltsturm. Weltsturm, not Holocaust, Weltsturm. So then I went to the English collected works and checked how they translated it, and it was a world storm there. And again, they are describing what is happening in Europe today in the crazy years of 1948-49. And Magyar struggle and democratic Panslavism are terrible texts from contemporary multiculturalist perspective. There's no kind of recognition of rights of national minorities. They make sharp distinctions between us and them. This kind of a war mentality, post 9/11 mentality, that if you are not with us, if you are not with the revolution, you are against us. So it's those are really problematic texts, but they are not programmatic statements saying that what should be done. They are descriptions of what is happening in Europe today. And I also tracked down the original publication, Neue Rheinische Zeitung, just in order to make sure that this statement, Holocaust, this word, was not edited in East Germany when the collected works were published. And so we actually have it here in the library of the University of Minnesota. When I went to ask for a copy, that could they arrange a copy of that particular issue for me, they just checked and said, okay, cool, go down 2 flights of stairs to the sub-basement 2, we have it there. And, so I checked the original Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and there was no difference between the 2 texts, so it was not edited in East Germany. So this is this presentation of Marxism as an ideology of ethnic cleansing is really problematic. Marxist views on national issues, minority issues, are extremely problematic. They don't focus on those issues, but from contemporary standards, they are really problematic, not really recognizing any kind of right for minorities. But they were not different from other political writers of that era. So, for example, the liberal political philosopher John Stuart Mills writes in the exact same terms in the same area. So, the politics of history part of the film is problematic to say the least. So that leads us to ask questions about history politics. Why do they tell this kind of a narrative of the war? And here we come to the competitive victimology part. So traditionally, this kind of history politics of the Second World War and genocides, they have been either like international in the sense that it's one country against another, Poles against Germans, Baltic states against Russia. It's this kind of an international disputes in which history is somehow used to build identities, to shame your opponents, and so on. And it's also used in domestic politics, especially in struggles between the left and the right. So, but I would argue that the Soviet story is actually an example of the emerging pan-European space for history political struggles. They are neither international nor domestic, but there's an emerging, genuinely pan-European pan-European space for history political struggles. And if we think about this double genocide thesis and its use in domestic politics, well, we are pretty familiar with the use of the Hitler card, how you make these kinds of arguments by association, saying that, you are Nazis, and that's, of course, a card that can be played against the national conservatives in European politics. And now the national conservatives are kind of striking back. They are inventing the new Stalin card that could be played against all left-wing political groups in Europe. And the Soviet story is one example of that. But I would say that this began already in the Historiker strike in Germany, in which Ernst Nolte and Jürgen Habermas especially clashed over the interpretations of the Holocaust. But this is a card that can be used in European politics against the left and in domestic politics and against Russia in international politics. But the European nature of the of this politics of history activity of the Soviet story becomes really apparent in the one of the closing quotes from the film. It basically closes with this statement, saying that the victims of the Soviet crimes are quietly passing away, receiving no comfort, no justice. In the European Union, that is reserved for other victims, of course, victims of the Holocaust. Looking at this frame monument in the very center of Europe, I think you can all recognize that it's Marx and Engels in Berlin. One can't help thinking that it stands here because deep in their hearts, many Europeans still believe in what these two men so persistently maintain. That when inferior nations are being killed, it cannot be seen as a crime because it makes way for the more advanced nations to build a better life. With this ideal, while this ideal is alive, while the specter of these two men is haunting Europe, it will be very hard for its various nations, for the various nations of Europe to be truly united. So here we have a kind of a pan-European history, pan-European history politics, because now this comes from Latvia. This is supported by the national conservative circles in the European Parliament, and those circles are usually said to be racists. They are, of course, anti-immigrant. They are against rights of national minorities and so on. And I would say rightly so. Most of them are they are called racist, and I would say rightly so because they really are. Many of those parties really are outright racist parties. But with this move, they are trying to kind of divert the attention to the European left, saying that the real racists in European politics, those that are truly against European integration of Europe of nations, you have those politicians in the left, not in the right. And this can be used by Latvians to say that we were the real victims. We were the victims of this genocidal, murderous regime, and therefore, well, because we are victims, we are not perpetrators. You should not really judge how the policies we implement today on the Russian speakers in these countries. So it's a history political move, and it's interesting in its truly pan-European nature. It uses experts and politicians from all over Europe, from France, from the Baltic states, from Poland, from Russia, from Finland. It uses experts from all corners of Europe to make the same argument, that if you want to blame someone for being racist and anti-European, you should not blame the conservative right, you should blame the liberal left, the Marxists in Europe. So I will conclude this presentation of the Soviet story with a dilemma that I don't really know how to answer. How can we criticize the use of mass atrocities without denying or downplaying those atrocities? So how can we how is it possible to criticize political moves like the Soviet story without becoming a kind of a denier or minimizer of the mass atrocities that were truly massive, that were clear crimes against humanity? So how can we criticize their political use without at the same time somehow unintentionally minimizing or denying those? So I will leave you with that dilemma and hope someone could give me an answer.
We think we'll have a 5-minute coffee break, and we'll start. We'll have 45 minutes later for discussion and questions. So yeah, help yourself to the coffee. I would like to start thanking Lars, Breuer, and Jutila for this really thought-provoking, compelling presentations which raised many questions. Ended with each question, which is the room to address. I want to be very brief and just maybe raise a few more questions, try maybe to link some developments in this paper in order to frame a little bit the discussion. We have here, I mean, you have tackled similar subject, but the objects of study are different. Right? You've talked about vernacular memory, and Matti has spoken about what you define as public memory, or you said it's for history politics or memory politics. So usually in memory scholarship, there is often a conflation between memory politics and collective memories from the grounds, and maybe the fact that we have here a sociologist and a political scientist may help us to navigate a little bit this, the methodological and the substantial discussion on what collective memory actually is. So the question here for Matti would be: you mentioned the Stockholm Declaration and the Prague Declaration as similar but going different directions. Both of them are top-down initiatives. They are memory politics or history politics, and we see that these are somehow elite-led mnemonic narratives. But the Stockholm Declaration, as we know, and I think this came out clearly also from, you mentioned it yesterday, Professor Himka, is that this idea of that the Holocaust becomes, even in Western Europe, a shared memory does only exist at that level of memory politics. So the question would be, do you see a clear transition from history and memory politics into collective memories, into vernacular memories, how people will relate, speak about this past? In other words, when we talk about the divided memory in Europe, we may speak about the divided memory politics, but not necessarily a a divided collective memory, and your paper, Lars, addressed that, since victimhood is somehow something that cuts across, the notion of victimhood, that cuts across Western Europe, or at least Germany and Poland. So these are, this is one of the issues we wanted to address. The Holocaust is definitely not a shared memory, but the Holocaust is a sort of a memory paradigm, as it serves somehow as a trope that allows other memories to latch itself, or that Holocaust memories latch itself to other memories. So another issue I wanted to ask is the insistence on genocide. And genocide is by itself defined as a crime against a national, racial, ethnic, or according to the convention, religious group. So can these type of crimes, when they are defined as genocide, these ethnified crimes, racist crimes, can they be remembered, and this is related to this temporal dimension, by subsequent generations in a way that political crimes cannot? Because when you explained us about memory politics of the Soviet story, we're seeing how the Soviet crimes, or the crimes of the Soviet regime, become ethnified, and there's a strong attempt to define them as ethnic crimes, which leaves out entirely the crimes that were committed mostly in Russia, not in the nations that were occupied by the Soviet Union or satellite. So how do the different generations, subsequent generations, deal with that histories and memories? Do they feel much more identified and by their predecessors' victimization, because the crime is defined in ethnic and national terms? These are a few questions I wanted to address, and if you want to address these questions, then we'll open it up to the audience. So that's not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for those comments. If I start with collective memory, I think it's an oxymoron. We cannot have anything like collective memory. It's a term that is, it's a category of practice that, in my opinion, should not be used as a category of analysis, because it's a category of practice used by nationalists who believe that nations are some kind of a human-like units. It has really strong anthropomorphic connotations, saying that that nations as entities can remember. They have this kind of a human individual character. So if we take a quote from Anthony Smith, who says that memory is an active principle of recall of earlier states of activity and experience of a person. By analogy, collective cultural identities are based on shared memories of experiences and activities of successive generations of a group distinguished by one or more shared cultural elements. So if we think about memory as this kind of an active recall of earlier states of activity and experience, and then transfer that to collectives like nations, how can you remember something that you have not experienced? No one in this room has experienced the Holocaust or the Second World War. The number of people who have actually experienced that and who can kind of actively recall that is diminishing really rapidly. And so I think this collective memory as a term is something that I try to avoid. I of course know that in memory scholarship there are much more sophisticated understandings of collective memory, but I think the practices that they refer to are collective commemoration rather than memory. It's not active recall of past experiences and activities. It's commemoration of events and practices, activities, processes that they have not experienced themselves. And this is the Soviet story is of course one form of such activity. It's one form of this kind of public commemoration of past in certain ways. Public commemoration of the past for the purposes of the present. And in these kinds of activities, I think Europe is really divided in so many ways that it's this division that I discussed between kind of old and new Europe, between the left and the right, between the new member states of the European Union and the old. It's just one division within within Europe, and I actually think that that this kinds of smaller scale individual memories are a nice form of resistance against these hegemonic narratives of how we should remember certain events. So for even though those individual memories can be used in the production and reproduction of the hegemonic narratives of the Soviet Union, of the Holocaust, they also offer great sites for resistance against them. So I, for example, myself studied studied the war experiences of Finnish soldiers who belong to national minorities, like Jews who had to fight in the war as brothers in arms with the Nazi Germany during the continuation war in Finland. The Tatar minority, Muslim minority in Finland, who now in this general Islamophobia that exists also in Finland. Their war experiences can be used as a great counter-narrative, because war narratives are also used by this kind of a radical national conservative sector of the society against current Muslim migrants. So we can say that okay, if we think about the war narratives that you use today to build your anti-immigration arguments, do you know how many Muslims served in the Finnish army in the Second World War? What is their experience? Their experiences of Ramadan during the war, their experience of how that helped them in the war, experiences of racism. So, for example, one Tatar soldier was killed because he was thought to be a spy, because he was wearing a Finnish uniform and speaking foreign language with his friend in the center of Helsinki. He was shot. So we could use that kind of like individual recollections of the war as sites of resistance against hegemonic narratives in this kind of a realm of public memory or history politics. And as for the big G, the genocide, I think it's one of those issues where you assign certain ideas of martyrdom and victimhood to a particular category, so of course that category becomes extremely attractive. That happened already with the Genocide Convention. So it's as if your suffering didn't really matter, as if the crimes committed against particular ethnic or class or sexual gender groups don't really matter if you cannot say that they are genocide. It's interesting politics in politics of history in that sense, that you have to kind of be able to make the connection to the big G if you want to make your suffering really count. And I think that's something that really distorts like proper politics of history debates in Europe today, and most likely also globally. But I of course study only Europe. So people think that if they can prove that these events were genocide, they believe that they are entitled to some kind of a greater glorification, maybe some kind of compensations or something like that. And I think that's something that doesn't really take us really far, as Timothy Snyder would say.
Yeah, we'll maybe start with the last point, the insistence on genocide. And I think if you were mentioning the cards played in a political game by the left and the right, and it occurred to me that in the last caption you were showing, it was actually not individuals but nations that were portrayed as victims of Stalinism. And I think this is the claim that the political right is making, that certain groups or nations or ethnicities are actually portrayed as victims, and this is why it's necessary to speak of genocide in terms of ethnic crimes, and why for example, the Holodomor is not addressed as a political crime or a sociocide, but as a genocide, because otherwise he could not claim make this claim of victimhood on an ethnic level, which is I think an important political instrument of the right. And this leads me to the notion of collective memory, and I tend to partly disagree on what you said about the concept, because I think, like, my point of departure as a sociologist is that memory actually tells us more about the present than about the past, because it always serves present-day interests, and it doesn't have to be authentic at all. It doesn't require any personal experiences at all. And studies also in neurosciences and psychology have shown that you can even implant individual memories in people's head, and then they will tell about it as if, and they will be 150% sure they did experience this.
Like NBC News.
Yeah. So there is no necessity of actual individual experiences, and there's no and I think it doesn't make sense to look for authenticity or accuracy in memory. And what does make memory collective in a certain sense is that or if you describe memory as the process of making sense of the past in terms or in the prospect of the present or the future, you could say that the formation of group identities and the images of the past, or making sense of the past, go along with each other. And here again, it's important to stress that we're talking about groups in a social sense, so it's an empirical question whether there is a collective memory of a given group. And then again, the claim that there has to be something like a memory collective on the level of a national community or an ethnic group, that is a political claim mostly made by the right. So, and another claim from the left would be that there is a common identity and a common perception of, for example, the working class. So there would be another claim, but it is not to say that there actually is a collective memory in empirical terms. And so to distinguish collective memory from memory politics, I would say, well, collective memories can be said to be making sense of the past. Memory politics is making use of the past in a political way. So you have so things like the Stockholm and the Prague Declaration are definitely attempts to make use of the past in political terms, whereas many of the participants in my group discussions are rather trying to make sense of the past for themselves or for their family narrative. So, for example, a very important groups in the sense of collective memory are often families, where you have a lot of studies showing that actually the emotional bondings within family are often decisive factor in choosing certain narratives. So, for example, in German families, you would have a lot of people who know everything about what happened during National Socialism and during the Holocaust, but they will kind of accept their own family from it in order to maintain a positive image of their grandparents. So there is certainly something about group identity or group cohesion or whatever you want to call it collective memory. And maybe as a last point, for the focus on the Soviet crimes, at least for the Polish case, I would say that here the experience of the post-war decades is decisive, because in Poland, throughout the communist times, everyone was told that the Germans were the bad guys and the Soviets were our friends. So there is no need to tell anyone anymore that the Germans did bad things while they occupied Poland, because everyone knows. But on the other hand, the urge to speak out about what the Soviets, or as they are called, the Russians, did to the Polish people is still so large that when you read the interviews, you get the impression that the Germans invaded Poland for maybe a couple of weeks, and then the Russians came and stayed for some decades. And sometimes even the stories, like the way the Soviets or the Russians and the Germans are portrayed in the family stories, you really get an impression that the Germans just came to visit and have a cup of coffee, and then the real bad things happen when the Soviets come. So. And I think this again is not an attempt to give an accurate account of what happened by the people, but it's rather telling us something about their desire to put things into perspective and to react to what they've been told or their parents have been told in school, in books, and basically everywhere for a number of years without having a chance to counter that view before '89.
Thank you. We'll open it up to our participants. There's a question, Christian.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed both papers, which were fascinating in many ways. My question is mainly about, or to Lars's very interesting discussion. I just wonder whether you can say a little more. As a sociologist, I completely endorse your conceptual kind of commitment to vernacular memory. But I just wonder whether you can tie that thread a little more closely to your data, because, as you point out at the beginning of your presentation, vernacular memory implies a process of something being appropriated in terms of discourses on the level of public or official memory being reappropriated by on a grassroots level. And I guess I couldn't quite see which bits of public official German discourse in your German data were being reappropriated, or how you'd kind of trace those bits of discourse. And I was thinking across to Bill Niven's work on Germans as victims. And he, as you know, kind of says, well, that kind of victimology in a German context is largely a post-1989 phenomenon. Do you endorse that, or do you think there is a longer genealogy of German victim that kind of goes back to these family dynamics you've just mentioned? And related to that, if I may, I'm a little surprised by what you've just said about the Polish case, because that really implies a real sort of mismatch between, for example, in terms of official memory, if you go to the history of the Warsaw Uprising, that's not the balance of historical narratives being conveyed there. And the emphasis there, for obvious reasons, is on German perpetration rather than, and there's a relatively small room by comparison given over to dedicated to the Soviet chapter. So can you just maybe talk a little bit more about again that process of what is being appropriated in each of the two settings to your really interesting work?
Sure. Yeah, to me, a few questions.
We can collect 3 questions. Adam, Joachim, and then. Yeah, please.
Right, thank you very much for these 2 papers. I've got a few questions and comments. Right? I will try to be as quick as possible. The first to Lars' question is that what struck me is this the status of vernacular memory in comparison to these other realms of memory, as you mentioned, public memory and official memory. It probably could work, but only in the liberal constitutional democracy, but on all other regimes, not at all, which means you have to state clearly that some sort of the institutional structure influence the status and the function of the vernacular memory. But then the question, people, is such, maybe what struck me here was that what you mentioned only these different models or the different perception of victimhood. Remember you mentioned that Poland's is sort of the messianic and the German one is different. So could you please elaborate, say more, maybe identify some other concepts of the victimhood? And then the small question, but how do you explain this competition for the victimhood, which is not only European, it's a global one. It means nowadays everybody wants to be a victim, even myself, in comparison in the family. Right? So it means, but I don't know how to explain that. It means, what is this connected with the politics of recognition? But if so, well, how it's translated to the politics of distribution and so on, so on. So it seems to me that that's one of the crucial questions. Then to the second our speaker, well, I've got plenty of problems. But the starting problem is such, it means that I will need some more explanation why you choose this documentary movie. What is the heuristic status of this movie? It means when this discussion here started with the concept of the collective memory. But if we start to think that our perception of reality or real time at the moment, now, is totally different than the past. So we think about the past only through the symbols, right? Then the symbols are connected with emotions as well. And there is a never-ending fighting, basically, or struggle for the intersubjective meaning of these symbols. Then the movie, the status, is not a scholarly work. It means the movie, actually, is precisely trying to play with emotions. Therefore, it constitutes a totally different type of discourse. Applying the normal discourse to this type of this form, it seems to me is a methodological mistake. Right? So I mean, that's why the more explanation what we wanted to achieve, actually, not only destroy. Then I don't like this counting of the bodies, 1 million, let's say. That's not a proper approach. As you know, it's basically all those memory studies, always somebody make this reference to Leo Tolstoy, right? That each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Therefore, comparison between the suffering, victimhood, is morally wrong. The second, impossible, basically. Then, what is the other option? I have no idea. I'm putting the question on the table. And then, last but not least, well, probably when you formulate the problem, building a nexus between Marx thought or Marxism and ethnic cleansing is impossible to justify. But it is possible, it seems to me, justify the connection between Marxism and the mass atrocities. Only as an example, Zygmunt Bauman, what he claimed, his biggest claim is that he finds this connection between the Holocaust and Enlightenment. Enlightenment as a peculiar vision of the world, worldview. So to speak, Marxism was precisely the product of Enlightenment. Therefore, this nexus could be found, it seems to me, easy.
There are more questions, I think there's plenty to hear. I would ask you if you can be brief so we can have more time for other questions.
Maybe to the first question of the reappropriation, I was kind of disappointed when I went through my interviews because it's really, I had a hard time telling if people didn't make explicit references to, so I could get a sense of what they're referring to, but it's very rare actually that they refer to, say, let's say I heard this in school, or my grandma told me, or I've read this in that book. So you can only, vaguely describe it or figure out for yourself where they might have gotten this from. And just to take up that example, these discourses of German victimhood definitely have become more prevalent after, I would say, around 2002. But there are so many references to the direct post-war era, to the 1950s in terms of narrative structures, and these narratives always have been maintained. Although a major claim of what Bill Niven calls the new German victim discourse is a thesis of a so-called taboo, that it was never allowed to talk about German victims of the wartime before, and that is completely nonsense. Everyone knows it, but it's a very performative rhetoric device in this whole discourse on victimhood. But I think it's rather something that you can find, and a couple of scholars have shown that you can also find it in the 60s and the 70s, in the 80s in different forms. So it's been there. It's not been dominant, but they have been references. And just briefly to the Warsaw Rising, what I find striking, of course, this is mainly about the Germans fighting the rising down, but the emphasis in the commemoration of the Warsaw Rising in the recent years in Poland is actually on not so much on the Allies, like letting Poland down, the Western Allies, but mostly on the Soviets, who decided not to help the Polish resistance, but to sit back and wait until the Germans finish the job and then take over to make sure that there will be no independent Poland after the war. That's the main narrative which you have in the commemoration of the Warsaw Rising in the recent years. And to Adam, like first of all, vernacular memory, I agree that this is mostly these three realms mostly refer to liberal democracies, but I would argue that even in dictatorships you have some kind of vernacular memory, even if it's not articulated or there's no chance of articulating it publicly. But for example, in communist Poland, you had certain narratives about Soviet crimes, the whole discourse about the Katyn massacre, which was told within families or maintained by intellectuals in exile. So it's something like what Adorno called, I don't know the English word, the Flaschenhals, maybe.
Bottleneck.
The bottleneck. So you have a narrative and it's somewhere and it can be dug out later when you have a more open society. So, but I think that it's important to stress that there are narratives that are maintained maybe only on a private scale, which can be more important again at later stages, and that this is often neglected. And you also find that in arts and literature, and this is often neglected, I think, when you only look at official and public realms of memory. Then for the concepts of victimhood, I think it's mainly about the differences of the English words sacrifice and victim, and in some, for example, in German, the term Opfer covers both more or less, but then I would say that this notion of sacrifice has completely vanished after 45, because it was much exploited by the Nazis, that people have to sacrifice your life for Germany and for the German cause, and this is nothing that anybody wants to hear about anymore in Germany since 45. So this is why this notion of victimhood is totally there is a total absence of this sacrificing aspect of victimhood. Whereas in Poland you still have this long tradition of from the going back to the 19th century, when there was no Polish state, and to maintain a moral how can you say that, to portray yourself as morally strong, even though you're for example, there's references to all the risings in the 19th century of Polish nationalists that failed, but they still portrayed themselves as victors or heroes in a moral sense. And there's a tradition going back to that one. But right now I'm having a hard time finding more concepts of victimhood. And as to the attractiveness of this state of victimhood, I would say that it has to do with this transnational approach of learning lessons from the past, and that memory or memorizing especially atrocities and mass crimes has become a value in itself, and as some kind of attempt to make sense of it, I think victimhood is attractive because you can get a moral surplus out of dealing with these dark chapters of the past. And since the old figure of the hero of like when you go back in time, or in how, for example, how wars have been looked at, that it had always been the big heroes who won battles and saved our nation, and this is not appropriate anymore when it comes to the memory of mass atrocities. So in order to get something positive out of it. I think people opt for the moral surplus of being pure victims, and here the Holocaust is the role model.
Okay. First of all, the status of this film. This film actually caused quite a bit of controversy in Europe when it premiered, and that basically started our interest in it. And well, I'm not going into details of this process, why I'm still talking about the film more than 5 years later. but it did cause quite a lot of controversy, and it received a really strong reaction from Russia, from what is the name of the amateur historian who he published a book kind of that was titled something like Soviet Lies, as a kind of a response to this. It's not duking, but one of the kind of semi-official historical figures published a book against this, and the Nazi organized demonstrations against the pro-Putin youth movement organized demonstrations against this film. So it gave this movie actually a kind of a victim status, that if it attracts such a strong reaction from the nationalist circles in Russia, it must be right. Kind of speaking truth to power gets this glorification of victimhood for the movie, and it's kind of like Galilei in front of Inquisition saying that mumbling truths in front of it. And even though it's a movie, it claims to be a documentary, and it makes historical claims. And here I actually agree with Jorma Kalela, the Finnish historian whom I cited, that we must take all these public representations of history seriously. Because if we don't take them seriously, they continue their lives unchallenged. And here, I totally agree with you that we should not. This counting of bodies is really a bizarre exercise, but it's what this film does, and that's one of its historical claims. Claims that it makes is the amount of suffering. And in order to kind of challenge it, I have to engage with those also. The section where I discuss these cases, I've titled that section as Petty Politics with Body Parts. Because that's what they do. They use those numbers. It's political use of those numbers. Numbers are significant for the argument that they make, and therefore I have to engage with the numbers also. And as for the Marxism, I'm familiar with Bauman's argument, and Marxism certainly falls within that category. But that's again an argument that the movie does not make. They claim that Marx publicly, openly advocated ethnic cleansing. Marxist views on nations are really problematic in so many ways, but that's not one of the problems with it. So in a sense, I agree with your criticisms that this is something that should not be done, but because the movie does it, I think I also have to engage with those problematic practices.
Joachim and Sarah want to make a question.
Well, time is almost up, but let me just make two very brief comments. I was very pleased, Lars, when you in your research now addressed the vernacular memory of the Holocaust, because we hear very much more about the public and official memory. What would have been really interesting to learn more about, maybe this is a different chapter of your book, is the interaction, you refer to that, between the public and official memory on the one hand and the vernacular memory on the other hand. I think this is one argument in the Oper of Archive Nazi, that the pressure of public memory and the acknowledgement of the Holocaust in German official memory puts pressure on families to or motivate families to construct family history in a way that exculpates Opa, the grandfather who might have been involved in one way or the other in the Holocaust. So learning more about this interaction would be interesting. Maybe that's the topic for another conversation. And then also, of course, the generation or cohort differences, as the current cohorts relate differently to the great-grandfathers who were involved in the Holocaust than the grandparents did to their grandfathers who were involved. So this is another conversation. Maybe I just wanted to raise the topic. And for Matti, just one very brief comment regarding your last questions. How can we address Soviet, etc., crimes without relativizing the Holocaust? I think we simply, as historians or sociologists or political scientists, have to study them with the best of all scholarly means. This is the only way to challenge distortions of history like the one you illustrated by way of the movie you analyzed so skillfully.
And I think he and I are thinking in similar lines, so I have comments, but we can talk about them afterwards and run out of time. I wanted to say, Lars, I appreciated this use of the multidimensional memory. I have not read the book, so this was new to me. One of the things I was struck by, with a matrix like that, it offers us typologies, but sometimes we ourselves get fixed into our typologies. I imagine that your narratives, right, these interviews, yielded a little more fluidity, and that also the potential for recognizing how memory is very much relational. Particularly insofar as it's attuned to, it hits a register of audience. And so I wonder if maybe you can talk about that. And then the other thing I'm struck by, and I think it goes with your last comment about how do we analyze the way in which, without minimizing mass atrocity, how do we analyze the use of memory, whether it's public, it's vernacular, it's institutionalized. And it seems to me that's being attentive not just to how memory is used politically in the present, but also very much its intentions for the future. And I do think this is also part of the vernacular. And I loved your very first quotation about the individual was saying, we need to maintain these boundaries, right? Because the boundaries otherwise between the victim and perpetrator, because otherwise they vanish. And in that statement, they vanish, to me, is not a preoccupation so much with the present as it is with an anxiety about the future. And that may be more specific to different types of post-conflict societies than you and I.
Just, I'll be really quick. I thought that it could be useful also to take Matti's final question on the slide, how to criticize the use of mass atrocities without denying or downplaying them. You could almost flip that and say, how can you examine the histories and the memories of these mass atrocities without giving fodder to these movements that use them? And I think it's actually going on. I think that there are people in Europe, including in Poland where I have the most experience, who actually do try to examine these things without making that leap into these ultra-nationalist abuses of that memory.
Maybe we extend 5 minutes, if that's okay for everybody.
I can just say thank you. I think there's not much for me to respond to this, but I just thank you for the comments. Give more time for Lars because there were genuine questions for him.
Well, I was hoping not to have so much time, but as I have to admit that this the links between the public and the vernacular, or the public and the official, are not that clear-cut as we did find it in other studies, as the so-called open study you've mentioned. And also, surprisingly enough, I didn't find any huge generational differences when concerning the main narratives I just mentioned. And this is also something that really, I double or triple checked. There are some there are differences in how people speak, and that the elderly were of course more referring to their own childhood experiences, and others were referring to books or their experiences as students abroad or something like that. But the main narratives actually are the same. So this is something that really struck me. And to Sarah, of course, I see this as an attempt, and actually what I have the same problem, for example, when I listened to Matti's paper, at points I wasn't sure if it's number 1 or number 4, and it's somewhere in between, but I just see it as an attempt, and all I wanted to do is to put a different perspective on it, and to see that there's not just this competition clear cut, but there's other ways of interaction, and also I think the common denominator of all 4 modes is that there is actually a dialogue in people's minds on how do the others see us, and how do we see the others, and which is preoccupied, I think, both with the present and the future. So thank you for the comments.
Thank you all for your comments and questions. Thank you to our presenters. We'll continue the conversation on the day, and now we'll have a break until 1:30. So thank you.